Hi, everybody. No bronchitis or no apparent laryngitis was going to keep me away from speaking to the next gentleman. I'm adding him to a long list of illustrious guests on the SAAD Truth. Today, I have with us Dr. Robert Lustig. How you doing, Rob?
Pleasure to be with you, Gab. And yes, it is very sad, isn't it?
For the people who might not know you, let me give them a brief introduction. And again, forgive me for the quality of my voice. So you are a pediatric endocrinologist. You're a physician that specializes in endocrinology as relating to children. You're a professor of pediatrics at University of California, San Francisco. Many people don't know that that particular school is consistently ranked, if I'm not mistaken, in the top three medical schools in the country. I think maybe Johns Hopkins might be another one. And then
Hopkins, us, Penn, usually that's sort of like the,
the,
the, the big four. Yeah.
right. We, by the way, share an alma mater. We both went to Cornell University. You are a world-renowned activist when it comes to the harmful effect of fructose and slash childhood obesity. We'll talk a bit about that.
Well, I don't want to call myself an activist. What I would rather call myself is a policy person. What I'm trying to do is bring the science to the policy. In the process, the politics get in the way. So in that respect, I have had to advocate. But an activist sounds awfully, shall we say, subversive.
Or dogmatic and free of... fair enough. Good. Thank you. I stand corrected. You're an author of more than 100 scientific articles and several books. Let me read those titles so I don't get them wrong. The New York Times bestseller, Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity and Disease. Sugar has 56 names, A Shopper's Guide. I like that title. And then the most recent book, which we will be talking about, let me plug it in for you right here. The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains. So we certainly won't have any inability to have a very fruitful conversation. What I thought
I think we work on different ends of the same spectrum.
Very true. So what I thought I would first do, sometimes people, viewers ask me, well, how did you connect with this person? What's your link to this person? So I thought I would just give the genesis of how I became aware of your work. I watched in short succession 2 documentaries while trying to stay fit on the elliptical. One was a documentary called Sugar Coated, in which you appear, and I'd like to talk about that documentary and your work against fructose. And then there was a second documentary called Merchants of Doubts, which I also want to talk about. But I thought we would start first. Number one, tell us about Sugar Coated and about your lifelong work fighting against the ill effects of fructose.
Well, first of all, I did not come to this issue with an agenda. I am a pediatric endocrinologist, so I take care of hormonal and glandular problems in children. Basically, I took care of short kids. And over the course of the last 30 years, those short kids got fat on me. And the question is, what's happening? Why is this occurring? And of course, the standard mantra from everyone was, well, they eat too much and they exercise too little. Except that there were several pieces of data in the literature that actually didn't support that. At that time, I was taking care of children who'd become massively obese due to brain tumors. So there's an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. It sits at the base of the brain, behind the eyes and sort of halfway back. And it controls all the hormonal secretions of the body. And when these children got a brain tumor in that area, they would, of course, develop pituitary problems like growth hormone deficiency. They would stop growing. But they'd also become massively obese. And they were perfectly normal before the tumor. And now they weigh 350 to 400 pounds, gaining 70 to 100 pounds a year. I mean, really ridiculously.
How old are these children? Are they 16 or are they 8?
0 to 18. Any age.
Okay.
And I was charged with trying to help these children. And it was very clear from the literature that these kids weren't eating more and exercising less. This was a hormonal reason. And at that time, we had just discovered this hormone called leptin. Leptin is the hormone that goes from your fat cells to your brain and tells your brain, you know what, I've got enough energy on board, I don't need any more. And so I was trying to figure out what was going on with leptin in these patients. Now, we figured out that because these kids couldn't see their leptin levels, their brains thought they were starving. And because they thought they were starving, everything they ate went straight to fat in an attempt to try to increase energy storage. And that would raise the leptin level, but they still couldn't see it because of the brain damage. And so this became a vicious cycle. So we ended up having to work downstream of that leptin problem. And what we realized was that these kids were releasing so much extra insulin from their pancreas in order to drive that energy into fat. So we tried to instead inhibit insulin release from the pancreas with a medicine. And sure enough, these kids stopped gaining weight, started losing weight, and more importantly, started exercising spontaneously, out of the blue. These were kids who sat on the couch, ate Doritos, and slept. And now, all of a sudden, they were being active. And the reason was because instead of the energy going to their fat cells, it was going to them. And so we then looked and saw whether or not this phenomenon might be going on in general, garden variety obesity without brain tumors. And sure enough, it was. So this then posed the question, all right, people today are releasing 2 to 4 times the amount of insulin that they did 40 years ago, based on oral glucose tolerance testing from 1975 and 2015. What could be the reason for that? And that's when I started thinking about, well, what diseases do children get today that they didn't get before? And the answer were 2, type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease. Prior to 1980, we never saw a pediatric patient with type 2 diabetes. Prior to 1980, we never saw a patient with fatty liver disease. In fact, the only patients with fatty liver disease up to that point were due to alcohol. Well, it turns out both type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease are the diseases of alcohol. But kids don't drink alcohol. But what do they consume that is metabolized exactly the same way as alcohol? And the answer is dietary sugar. Good. In fact, the fructose molecule is metabolized in the mitochondria of cells exactly the same way as is alcohol. And this then explained why children got these diseases now when they didn't before, is because of the increase in the added sugar consumption in all of our processed food. We have since done many studies to document that phenomenon and prove causation, and we now have it slam dunk. Sugar causes type 2 diabetes. Sugar causes cardiovascular disease. Sugar causes fatty liver disease. Sugar causes tooth decay, although we knew that before. And so that realization, that proof has enormous implications for policy. And the problem, of course, is that the food industry doesn't like this message. This is an inconvenient truth. And so I have had to sort of use the science to beat back the dark forces of industry in an attempt to try to institute some rational policy measures to try to deal with this problem on a global scale.
What I thought was so interesting, as you just mentioned regarding some of your interactions with industry, is that in Sugar Coated and then subsequently in Merchants of Doubt, there is this idea that there is a sort of common template or blueprint or playbook by which these merchants of doubts operate. So the classic example, of course, was there's absolutely no link between smoking and lung cancer. The science is still debated and so on. And then you see it in other domains. And of course, in the case of sugar, it's the same principle. So I wonder what your thoughts are on this sort of universal, propagandist playbook.
We're seeing it right now. Right. We're seeing it in Alabama. We're seeing it in Washington, D.C. Deny, deny, deny. it seems to work. I'm not sure why it seems to work, but it does. Perhaps as an evolutionary psychologist, maybe you can explain to me why that works.
I think
from
there's
a science standpoint, it doesn't work.
There's potential for collaborations between us, definitely. Yeah, I mean, look, I can't remember the exact quote, but I think John Galbraith, the famed Harvard economist, at one point remarked on people's inability to change their opinions once they take a position. And of course, in today's sort of political partisanship, you see that very clearly. I mean, you'd rather die than ever let the inconvenient new evidence coming in alter your position. And I suspect that there are some very interesting evolutionary principles that might explain why we are so difficult to shift away from strongly held ideological positions. Do you have any thoughts as to, they don't have to be evolutionary based, but what are some tactics to move people? Just the overwhelming tsunami of scientific evidence eventually catches up to them?
Well, that's a really good question. People ask me all the time, who are your nemesis? Who's fighting you? And I have a simple 4-word answer for them. The dinosaurs, the detractors, the dilettantes, and the drug addicts.
They all start with D.
The 4 Ds, yes.
4 Ds.
The dinosaurs are people who have spent their entire lives researching a specific hypothesis and can't bring themselves to think that they couldn't, that they might have gotten it wrong. And so they do everything they can to try to bolster up a failing hypothesis.
Can I interject right there? Sorry, hold on. Forgive me for interrupting you. What you just said, it perfectly captures my whole scientific career, because I came into the field of consumer psychology and psychology of decision-making, hoping to Darwinize it, to introduce evolutionary psychology into those fields. Most of the people who are housed in those disciplines come from a social constructivist perspective. We are not biological beings. What makes us different from other animals is we transcend our biology. So they are the dinosaurs who for close to 2 decades have refused to accept the idea that our brain doesn't magically arise out of thin air or out of culture. It's due to the processes of evolution. So I'm totally with you on the dinosaurs. I've lived it.
Well, here's the problem. Scientists are supposed to not be dinosaurs. That's why they're scientists. Whatever we believed 10 years ago is already wrong. Whatever we believe today will be wrong 10 years from now. And that's what the word research means. Research is do this over again to see whether or not, in fact, these hypotheses actually hold water. And the fact is that scientists are supposed to be able to change their hypotheses to fit the data. And the fact that this has been such an uphill climb, even with the science, has been, first of all, very, very disconcerting to me, because after all, I'm very willing to alter my hypotheses based on data. The fact that other people are not is really worrisome. And the question is this due to grant money? Is this due to industry payoffs? Or is this just due to an inherent incapability of people to see past their own nose? I just don't know.
Do you want to finish the other 3 Ds?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So then there are the detractors. Those are the people who have been, they're the libertarians, if you will. Keep government out of my kitchen. I don't care what the science says. I'm not playing, if you will. The people who get on the internet. They tend to be the 10% who leave very nasty messages and never use their name. They're the detractors. Then there's the dilettantes, who are basically people who are paid off by the food industry, such as a cadre of dietitians. I won't put all the dietitians in that basket of deplorables, but there are certainly many who espouse industry views because they're receiving money for having said so. And then finally, there are the drug addicts. Oh my God, you're attacking sugar. I can't live without my chocolate. I can't deal without my Coca-Cola. I can't bring myself to believe that what you're saying might actually be true because I'm addicted and I refuse to deal with my addiction.
Within those 4Ds, do you have a sense as to which of them is most difficult to get them to alter their positions? Sort of, is there a hierarchy of dogma amongst those 4Ds?
Well, the drug addicts actually do come around. They have to hit bottom before they'll start going up. And I take care of those patients in clinic, the people who've actually hit rock bottom and really want to do something to turn it around. And the fact is that the science sets them free when they understand that it's not their fault. People who are addicted to different things didn't go into it to become addicted. They became addicted, despite their best efforts. And so when you can marshal forces to help them, and when they understand that it isn't necessarily them to blame, you can actually turn them around. So I think that we do that actually pretty effectively. The dinosaurs are pretty darn set in their ways. And, again, I can't tell you why. And the fact that this issue has received so much, has engendered so much controversy within the scientific literature is really disturbing to me for many reasons. And I don't know what it takes to turn scientists around when they are absolutely dead set on saying, no, I won't change. The detractors, you can't fix a detractor. If they're a libertarian and they're going to be nasty on the internet, they're just nasty. And they're not going to listen to anyone else's opinion. They are only going to migrate to sources of information that are consistent with their worldview. And we see that now in Washington, D.C. As well. And
the proverbial echo chamber, basically.
Yes, of course. And they don't want to know any better. So I don't think they're going to be
swayed.
And I don't think I'm going to be able to argue the issue with them. And then, of course, there are the dilettantes, and they're being paid. And ultimately, the question is, who are these people? And a lot of them are politicians. And what I've realized is that as long as there are more dollars than votes, politicians will not change their minds. So we have to make sure there are more votes than dollars. And that's why public education on these issues is so important, because ultimately they will change their minds. They're not married to a specific concept or precept. They're just interested in staying in power. And if we can actually mobilize enough of the populace, they can change. So I think that we can change the drug addicts and we can change the dilettantes. I think the dinosaurs and the detractors are sort of unmovable.
Great analysis. Let's sink our teeth into, excuse my voice, into your latest book. Now, I must admit I haven't gotten through all of it. Thank you for sending it. I got through the first part. Maybe you could first tell us about the general sort of quick synopsis, and then maybe you could point to I loved your distinction between pleasure and happiness and the neuronal pathways that are engaged by each, and how we so often confuse the two. I thought that was a brilliant discussion.
Well, in fact, we confuse the two because they want us to confuse the two. So
and hence they're hacking our minds.
Point of the book. So we have a healthcare crisis. We have a social security crisis. We have an opioid crisis. And we have a depression crisis. People would say those four things are not related to each other. I actually think those are four manifestations of a single crisis. And what I try to lay out in the book is, what the empiric and the theoretical evidence for this concept is. I believe that we have, as a society, misconstrued and conflated these two positive emotions, pleasure and happiness. Now, you would say, well, hey, they both feel good, like why should I care? But in fact, they are not the same. They do both feel good, but they're not the same. So what's the difference? There are 7, and I outlay them in the introduction of the book. Number 1, pleasure is short-lived, happiness is long-lived. 2, pleasure is visceral, you feel it in your body. Happiness is ethereal, you feel it above the neck. 3, pleasure is taking, happiness is giving. 4, pleasure is experienced alone. Happiness is usually, not always, but usually experienced in social groups. Number 5, pleasure can be achieved with substances. Happiness cannot be achieved with substances. Number 6, the extremes of pleasure, whether it be substances or behaviors. So substances like cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, or behaviors like gambling, shopping, social media, internet, porn, all in the extreme lead to addiction. There's an addiction for every single one of those 10 things I just mentioned. But there's no such thing as being addicted to too much happiness. And finally, number 7, the big kahuna. Pleasure is dopamine and happiness is serotonin. Now, this may not mean anything to non-biochemists, but there are 2 different pathways in the brain. And they are overlapping, but they are clearly distinct, and they have different regulatory mechanisms. And when you understand the difference between the 2, you can actually parse the different feelings that you yourself experience as to whether they are one or the other. And it's important to do that. And the reason to do that is because society, and in particular industry and government, have confused those 2. And I believe, and I lay out the evidence for this belief in the book, that this is not by accident, that this is very much on purpose, that this is a plot. Now, not a conspiracy, but a plot to get you to buy their products or engage in the behaviors that are favorable to them. So, examples. Open happiness. The tagline for Coca-Cola for 10 years, the longest running campaign in the history of the company. Any happiness in that bottle? Whole lot of pleasure, sugar and caffeine. Anything else? Yeah, phosphoric acid, caramel coloring, carbonated water. It's pleasure, but it's not happiness. But if you think that there's happiness in that bottle, you're going to hike up your dopamine. And here's the problem. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It excites the next neuron. When dopamine is released from one neuron and travels across the synapse, the cleft between 2 neurons, and excites the second neuron, it causes that next neuron to fire. Now, neurons like to be excited. That's why they have receptors in the first place. But neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Okay? Constant overstimulation of neurons leads to neuronal cell death. This is why children who have intractable seizures end up severely delayed, is because that firing is damaging neurons as they sit. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to keep stimulating the same neuron over and over again. So the second neuron, the receiving neuron, has a fail-safe, an option B, a self-defense mechanism. What it does is it downregulates the number of receptors on the surface of the neuron. And what that means is that there are fewer sites for the dopamine to bind to, which means that the neuron will fire less frequently and potentially less strongly. So, in human terms, what does this mean? So you get a hit, you get a rush. Receptors go down. Next time you need a bigger hit to get the same rush. And the receptors go down, and a bigger hit, bigger hit, bigger hit, bigger hit, until finally get a huge hit to get nothing. That's called tolerance. And then when the neurons actually do start to die, that's called addiction. Right. So dopamine leads to addiction through this pathway. cell death and receptor downregulation. Serotonin, however, turns out to be inhibitory. It doesn't stimulate the next neuron. It actually puts the next neuron to rest. Well, you don't have to downregulate receptors if you're putting the neuron to rest, so serotonin does not downregulate its own receptor. So you can't overdose on too much happiness.
Right.
But there's one thing that downregulates serotonin: dopamine.
Right.
So the more pleasure you seek, the more unhappy you get.
Now, I know you're not a psychiatrist, but I'm sure you could weigh in on this. When a patient goes to see a psychiatrist for depression,
Yes.
the pharmacological intervention could be either through the serotonin pathway or through the dopamine pathway. What are the diagnostic tools that the psychiatrist will use in deciding which of the two pharmacological interventions are appropriate for a particular depressive case?
Well, for the most part, they use serotonin reuptake inhibitors because these seem to be the most effective at alleviating depression. Doesn't cause happiness per se, but it tends to alleviate depression. So dopamine agonists, for the most part, are not used to treat depression. We know this because, in fact, patients with Parkinson's disease, which is a defect in dopamine in a different part of the brain than the reward center. So it's in an area, it's a motor center called the substantia nigra. So dopamine serves two roles in the brain. It serves as the reward neurotransmitter, and it also serves as the motor function neurotransmitter for gross motor movements. And that's what's wrong in Parkinson's. So patients who have Parkinson's have decreased dopamine in this area called the substantia nigra. And in the 1970s, we started giving dopamine precursors, L-DOPA, to Parkinson's patients. And lo and behold, their motor function improved, which was good because the DOPA got turned into dopamine and helped that motor area.
Example, the tremors become less pronounced.
That's right.
Right.
And that's good. And we still do that today. But here's the key. Many of those patients, not all, but many of those patients who were treated with L-DOPA way back when became religious zealots and gamblers. And there's an entire literature on sort of dopamine excess due to Parkinson's disease therapy and all of these behavioral alterations that it makes in people. So these phenomena of religious zealotry, rather than, shall we say, religious contentment, and of course religion has both, this concept of gambling and other addictive behaviors is inherent in upping your dopamine. So for the most part, we don't treat depression with dopamine agonists. We treat them with serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So I would argue that the dopamine agonist story is a very different one.
Got it. Since you mentioned pathological gambling and pornographic addictions and shopping, so in two of my books, I have chapters dedicated to what I call dark side consumption: pathological gambling, pornographic addictions, eating disorders, compulsive buying. And what I argue, since I'm coming from an evolutionary perspective, why is it that if we're adaptive creatures, we succumb to these maladaptive realities? And the general story that I argue is that you take adaptive processes that now become maladaptive either because they misfire or they, for example, they become hyperactive. So OCD is a classic manifestation of this, right? It is adaptive to search the environment for threats. But usually most healthy folks will attend to that perceived threat once. The warning flag goes down and we're done. We tick it off. What happens to the OCD person is the second after he or she tends to that perceived threat, then the warning flag goes up. We get stuck in an infinite loop. And now there is neuronal evidence that there's literally this infinite loop that goes on. So are you at all informed in your work, generally by this evolutionary angle, to delineate the difference between proximate explanations, which is explaining how and what a mechanism is, versus the ultimate explanation, which is the Darwinian why. Do you tackle both layers of analyses, or are you much more in the proximate world, which is where most scientists lie?
Well, in terms of the book, most of it's in the proximate world because that's what people need to know in order to help them extricate themselves out. However, there is one section in chapter 2 that I think does go to this issue, and it has a name. It's the dirtiest 4-letter word in the English language. Love.
I was thinking F, but I figured there must be a trick. Yes.
Love. So it turns out there are 2 kinds of love, aren't there? There's what Brian Earp called acute love and mature love. And acute love is being in love, which is really infatuation. And then there's the mature love, which is sort of the contentment of, companionship and, not feeling alone, if you will. So it turns out that when people fall in love, they do really stupid things. Okay? The reason that happens is because your dopamine goes straight up and your serotonin goes straight down.
Right.
And in fact, being in love, infatuation, is an acquired OCD.
Interesting.
It is obsessive. It's obsessive compulsive disorder that virtually everyone on the planet has experienced at least once.
You constantly ruminate and have intrusive thoughts about your new partner. You can't do anything else. But by the way, forgive me for interrupting you. I'll cede the floor to you in a second. You might want, if you're not familiar with her work, check the work of Helen Fisher, who is a bioanthropologist who has looked at the neuroanatomy, neurophysiology of romantic love. Are you familiar with her work?
I am.
Okay.
And in fact, the data really do support this notion. Now, why it happens, I don't know from an evolutionary standpoint. What's in it for us to have this, sort of short circuit of these 2 pathways that leads to, this, problematic set of behaviors that virtually everyone on the planet experiences at least once in their lives. I don't know, and I would be very delighted if you could help me with that. But I do at least try to bring people in the book to the notion that virtually every thought, virtually every emotion that we experience is biochemically driven, because you sort of can't understand the difference between pleasure and happiness until you become reductionistic enough to understand its biochemistry. Because you have to, you have to understand the dopamine serotonin interaction in order to dig your way out of this morass.
Although I would say, and I'd love for you to comment on this, are you familiar with Randolph Nesse? Do you know who he is?
Yes, yeah, I do. Okay. He's also an evolutionary biologist.
Exactly. So he is trying to introduce evolutionary medicine as a standard part of the pedagogic training of future physicians. The idea being that there are insights that arise from the ultimate perspective that ultimately, you'd be remiss in not knowing about them. Notwithstanding the fact that it is perfectly reasonable to have a career working only in proximate. Most Nobel Prizes are won at the proximate world, not in the ultimate world. But the classic example I give, and there are many others, to take a medical example, is pregnancy sickness, right? There are 1 million proximate explanations and phenomena that have been studied as relating to pregnancy sickness. How do olfactory different smells alter the severity of the symptoms of pregnancy sickness? That's a proximate question. The ultimate question asks, what is the evolutionary reason for women to universally experience this physiological response? And then the answer turns out to be, and it's been borne out by the data, is that during organogenesis, it is uniquely important for the woman to not be exposed to teratogens, food pathogens that might wreak havoc on the organ development in utero, and therefore she is unattracted. She has disgust for certain types of foods that might have high pathogenic load. She's attracted to foods that have antimicrobial properties. And now, how does that turn out to have an adaptive benefit? Well, women who experience more pregnancy sickness turn out to have less miscarriages, turn out to have more, when a child is born, better outcomes. Therefore, there is a defense function in having pregnancy sickness. But when you go see your gynecologist, what does he or she do? He assigns you a prescription that attenuates, that's to stop it. So while I understand that the symptoms might be problematic if you have to give a PowerPoint presentation to your coworkers, the adaptive function is there for a reason. And so do you foresee ever...
Before you ask that question, we know that hyperemesis gravidarum, or pregnancy sickness, is particularly bad with boy babies, with boy fetuses, rather than
so. Is that right? Okay. And why is that?
Now, boy fetuses have a decreased incidence of survival in utero and in the first month of life. And the reason is because boy babies, because they're missing some of the Y chromosome, actually have immune dysfunction. Is it possible that hyperemesis gravidarum, by protecting the early fetus from environmental toxins or exposures, is helping keep that pregnancy alive, because boy fetuses are more likely to involute?
That is a fantastic finding. So, with that in mind, do you foresee medical schools becoming more open to introducing evolutionary theory within their programs, or will they always be struck in proximate world, because ultimately that's where most of the interventions are going to come from?
So, forward-thinking medical schools recognize three things. Number one, nutrition matters. Number two, evolutionary medicine matters. And number three, prevention matters. Most medical schools are not forward-thinking.
Right.
We here at UCSF, because we're UCSF, have adopted some of those. But I will tell you right now, we are not nearly as accomplished in any of those three as we should be. In fact, we are going down the road of personalized medicine, genomic analysis, targeted treatment. And I'm for that, but I'm also for public health. And virtually every one of those things, evolutionary medicine, nutrition, and prevention, are basically in the public health bin as opposed to the personalized medicine bin. We need both. And unfortunately, we are not seeing most medical education moving in that direction. And in part, it's because of the influence of big pharma on medical education in this country and also in Canada.
Very interesting. Returning to your book, at the end of the book, you sort of have a prescription or prescriptive section, which, by the way, for my next book, my book agent is telling me. So in my next book, I talk about what I call, in a sense, it's related to your hacking of the mind. I've coined this term, or this malady, ostrich parasitic syndrome, where people deny the truth in a pathological manner. And so even though the ostrich doesn't do this, the metaphor is apt that, you bury your head in the sand. It's parasitic because in the same way that there are all sorts of species that once they are infected, literally parasitized by a brain worm, they do all sorts of maladaptive things. Well, I argue that parasitized ideas could lead us down the same thing. But he told me...
That's what the book is about.
Exactly. As I was reading it, I was saying, I got to talk to this guy.
So here's the question, and you better know the answer to this, or you're gonna have to go back to graduate school. Okay, what is the difference between marketing and propaganda?
I only know the answer that you want because I saw you discuss it on a interview, so I don't want to cheat. So, do you want me to answer it?
Sure.
I think if I remember correctly, it was a conversation you were having with one of your UCSF colleagues. And you basically, I think, said The difference between the two is that marketers are also engaging in propagandizing, but they tell the truth, whereas the propagandists don't do that. Is that?
That's marketing. Marketing is using.
Thank God I don't have to go back to graduate school. Okay.
Yes, no, you got it. Marketing is using information to espouse your point of view. Propaganda is using disinformation to espouse your point of view. The difference between marketing and propaganda is the truth. When companies or industries or governments tell the truth, they're marketing. When they don't tell the truth, it's propaganda. And the problem is that propaganda, as we know, evolutionarily, does things to our brains. Basically, it's designed to up your dopamine. And it basically, the echo chamber, that's designed to up your dopamine. You're basically hearing things that you want to hear because it gives you that dopamine boost.
That's fantastic, because you're basically offering a biochemical explanation for some of the things that I'm writing about. I actually had a prospective doctoral student write to me and say, I would love to study the neuronal signature of OPS. And in a sense, you're talking not about the neuronal, but the biochemical manifestation.
It's neurochemical.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. You're familiar with Sam Harris.
A good friend of mine, and I've been on his show. Yes, I'm familiar with him.
Okay, so he's one of the four horsemen of atheism.
Yes.
He's a neuroscientist.
Yes.
He is an honest-to-goodness neuroimager. He's known for his other work, but he's a neuroimager, and he did a study, and I recorded it in the book several years ago, back 2009, I believe. He took 15 religious zealots and 15 atheists and stuck them in the functional MRI scanner. And while they were in there, he recited to them different statements that would either engender their
positions,
their position, or detract from it. And it turned out that it didn't matter whether they were the atheists or the religious zealots. When they heard the statement that coincided with their position, their dopamine pathway, their nucleus accumbens just lit up like a Christmas tree. Fantastic. And when they heard the opposite, it was absolutely silent. So we are all gravitating now toward the things that give us that dopamine boost, whether it's true or not. Now it becomes our truth because it is dopamine, and it's what we want, and it's what makes us feel good, at least at the moment, and it causes us to work against our own self-interest because we can't rationalize anything else. And we are seeing this all over the world.
So when you're familiar with the term safe spaces on campuses, which maybe I will talk about it. So in a sense, the social justice warrior who is fighting for his or her safe space to be protected from opposing points of views is, in a sense, when you reduce it, when you go reductionist in your discussion, is really saying that it is profoundly unpleasurable for me to hear positions that might be deeply threatening to my committed ideological position, and hence I need a safe dopamine space so I can get my ideological high. That's literally what's happening.
I want to stay in my echo chamber. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So yeah, but this is really, sort of like the harbinger of societal destruction.
Right. Yeah, I hear you. I want to hold back on the
This is an existential threat to our very society. Not just society, but the planet.
I'm with you. I want to come back to your prescription part. By the way, just to finish my point about my book agent, he told me you can't just be the guy who comes and tells us all of the bad news, all the people being parasitized by ostrich parasitic syndrome. You also have to give us hope. You have to give us prescriptions. You have to give us ways.
Your agent is right.
Right. And of course, you did that perfectly in your last section where you talk about the 4 C's. Walk us through these, please.
So the goal is to up your serotonin and tamp down your dopamine, reduce your cortisol, which we haven't talked about, which is, the stress hormone that makes both sides of the neural pathway worse. So it basically alters dopamine signaling to make addiction more likely, and it also reduces serotonin 1A receptors to make depression more likely.
Can I offer a personal anecdote to that? My personal anecdote, forgive me for interrupting you, Rob.
Okay.
It's always dangerous to share something personal, because then the 10%, what did you call them? The detractors?
The detractors.
And when you have a large following, that tsunami is a very big tsunami. I noticed myself, as someone who is very perfectionist, I could engage in all sorts of sort of ruminative thinking about my perfectionism. When I am more stressed, and hence my cortisol levels are more likely to be up, although I don't have the lab results to prove it, I just feel it, I'm more stressed, I'm much more prone to succumb to this ruminative thinking. When I am relaxed, I absolutely am impervious. The ruminative thoughts cannot penetrate. But put me through stress, and I'm a looping, machine. So it's exactly what you're saying, right?
Indeed. The point is, we have the neuroscience and the biochemistry to delineate all of these phenomena that we see in patients, people, society. You have to understand it in order to be able to fix it. And I don't think people want to understand it. And it's very disturbing because we are really now, we've sort of entered this new phase of post-truth where, you only have your own truth instead of the truth. And we're going to be on the, we're going to kill the planet.
By the way, this difference between truth versus my truth is one of the parasitic memes that I talk about in the book. Postmodernism is the intellectual courant that really sets that, because postmodernism says that, there are no universal truths other than the one universal truth, that there are no universal truth. Everything is relative. And so it's by its very definition, postmodernism is anti-science, because while we may never hope to aspire to get perfectly to the truth, as scientists, we wake up every day hoping to, as best as we can, approximate something of an understanding towards truth. Well, postmodernism says there is no such thing. You're always constrained by your relative position, your biases, and so on. So that's a horrifying parasitic meme to have within the ecosystem of the university, no?
Well, it is. Here's what I would say is that these things go in cycles. Richard Hofstadter many years ago wrote a book about the anti-intellectuals of the early 20th century.
Oh, yes.
Jennings Bryan being an example, ran for president, did not win. In fact, the anti-intellectualism movement has been around for a while, but it comes and it goes, it comes and it goes. You had Father Coughlin in the 30s, you had McCarthy in the 50s. It happens, but then it gets squelched, it gets suppressed down. And the question for today is this just another blip in the cycle, and are we going to ultimately be able to recoup, or is this really sort of the beginning of the end? And I think it depends on whether or not governments like North Korea's and the United States end up hitting a button, or whether countries like the United States and China actually deal with our environmental fragility.
Right. And of course, in Merchants of Doubt, they talk about, since you mentioned the environment, they talk about how the sort of the climate denier types use that same blueprint used for sugar industry or smoking industry to sort of negate the science and so on, correct?
Exactly. Well, basically, as long as you say the science isn't settled,
you're done.
The science isn't settled.
It's a mic drop. You're done. Exactly.
Look, you pay people off. You say the science isn't settled. You pay scientists to generate anti-science science or pseudoscience. You, market that, as propaganda, because it's disinformation, and you can turn things around. I mean, we had Nazi Germany, we've had McCarthyism, what's going on in the Middle East today. Here, I mean, we don't have to go very far. You even have it in Canada.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
We're
Yes, we do.
Canada is catching up to Sweden as the #1 most progressive country. In quotes, I say.
Quotes. Well, my daughter is a freshman at the University of Toronto.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes, yes,
Well,
at Trinity College. And I will tell you, she has said, most Canadians are really nice, really cool, and really chill. But there are some that aren't.
Do we want to now I just want to mention the 4 C's to sort of get people excited about, reading your book. There's connect, contribute, cope, and cook. I'm assuming that each of these domains are one means by which you increase your serotonin and decrease your dopamine. Is that the general story?
Exactly right. And we have the evidence base for it. We have the studies to show why these work. And all of them are free, and they're all things your mother told you,
right.
But you forgot them because you were busy texting while quaffing a Coca-Cola. Connect, and connect does not mean Facebook. Connect means interpersonal, eye-to-eye connection, like you and I are doing right now.
That's why, by the way, I don't do my podcast only in audio, because there is a ecological validity and an intimacy that comes from this.
Yeah. So there's a set of neurons in the back of your head called mirror neurons. And what they do is they are reading in real time the expressions of the person you're talking to. Because every single society on the planet have the same facial expressions to mean the same emotions. Paul
Ekman.
Right. Paul Ekman.
He's at UCSF, isn't he?
Right. No, he's at Berkeley.
Oh, he's at Berkeley. Sorry. Okay.
Right. Went to Papua New Guinea, showed that, people who'd never been touched by, white people did the same thing, with their faces. So this is baked in to our DNA, is to be able to read the emotions of the people we're talking to, and we adopt those same emotions, and that's a process. We have a name for it. It's called empathy. And empathy is a primary driver of serotonin. So doing things for people and reading their emotions is essential to being able to experience happiness. People who can't do that only generate dopamine. They have a name too. They're called psychopaths.
Right.
And there's one in the White House. So connect, and it's got to be interpersonal. 2, contribute, and that does not mean to your IRA. It has to be outside of yourself. It has to be something for others. Okay, whether it be altruism, philanthropy, volunteerism. You can pay other people to do it for you if you need to. A lot of people ask me, can work satisfy as contribution? And the answer is yes, with 2 provisos. 1, you can see how your work ultimately affects others, and 2, your boss can see it too. And if both of those are satisfied, you can derive contribution through work, and that can make your work part of your happiness. 3, cope. And that's sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. And each of those are specific to reducing cortisol, because cortisol takes the area of your brain right here in the front, the prefrontal cortex, what I call the Jiminy Cricket of your brain, the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. Okay, the part of your brain that is basically destroyed when you are in OCD because you can't stop doing the stupid things. Okay, and it basically puts it into suspended animation as long as that cortisol is being driven. And so anything that gets your cortisol down will allow you to be able to up your serotonin by downing your dopamine, by putting, the concept of reward in its place. And then finally, number 4 is cook. So there are 3 items in food that matter. Tryptophan, which is the precursor to serotonin, which you find in eggs, poultry, fish. None of those are in processed food, not because they curdle and they go rancid. Number 2, omega-3 fatty acids, which are inflammatory, which is, wild salmon.
Oh, wow. Okay, right.
Farmed salmon. Okay, because the algae make the omega-3s, the fish eat the algae, we eat the fish, but farm fish eat corn, so they get omega-6s. So if you're going to eat farm fish, you might as well eat a steak. That's a problem. And then finally, fructose, which downs your serotonin through the process of metabolic syndrome that I describe in the book. So a high tryptophan, high omega-3, low fructose diet, that's called real food. Problem is, you have to cook real food. A low tryptophan, low omega-3, high fructose diet, that's called processed food. And you don't have to cook processed food. You put it in a microwave. So cooking is essential because, number one, it's connecting because you're sitting around a meal with your family. 2, it's contributing. 3, it's coping because you have to be mindful and focused while you're cooking. And 4, it is cooking. So it's giving you all of the things you need for happiness. So sitting down, cooking a meal and sitting down with your family, not necessarily with your extended family at Thanksgiving, but with your family, the people you can at least look in the eye and agree with.
That you can stomach
is probably the single best thing you can do to promulgate your happiness long term.
Now, to take the last C, the food-related one, you're looking at these with the downstream dependent variables being related to the pleasure versus happiness dichotomy, the serotonin versus dopamine. But are you in a position to comment about how our nutritional habits might, for example, affect other likelihood of succeeding in terms of weight management, likelihood of forestalling, the typical health killers?
Well, that was the first book I wrote, Fat Chance.
Exactly.
It was all about that. Basically, there are certain things in our diet that are highly problematic in terms of disease generation. Everyone thinks saturated fat's the bad guy. It's not. Okay. There are certain fats that are bad. Trans fats are the devil incarnate. They're consumable poison. Omega-6s are pro-inflammatory and cause disease. Medium chain triglycerides, everybody's for, like coconut oil, but it's handled in a different way and can actually raise your serum triglycerides, which is not good. So there are, as opposed to, say, omega-3s, which are the single best thing you can put in your body, monounsaturates, which actually help your liver, and polyunsaturates, as long as you don't overheat them, where they turn into trans fats, are also very good. So different fats are not necessarily equivalent in terms of their disease-generating capacity. In addition, sugar is uniquely pernicious, and of course, when we took the fat out of food, the food became unpalatable, so we added sugar back in order to basically make us eat it. And the food industry realized when they added more sugar, we bought more. And so they added more sugar yet again. And so we are consuming enormous amounts. And sugar, because of its effect on the liver, direct effect causing fatty liver disease, because fructose and alcohol are both metabolized into fat in the liver, which causes the liver to not work well. All the chronic diseases that we know today can be linked to this phenomenon of fatty liver insulin resistance.
Could a lot of the effects that take many, many years to develop, plaque buildup, fat liver disease, couldn't these be not just stopped, but could they be reversed with aggressive lifestyle changes, as per sort of Ornish's arguments?
Yes. So Ornish has shown very nicely that you can reverse cardiovascular plaques by being on his diet, which is a very low fat diet. But it is also a very low sugar diet, and it is also a very high fiber diet. And the question is, of those three, the low fat, the low sugar, and the high fiber, which is the most important contributor to the reversal of cardiovascular plaques? And I would argue it's the high fiber.
If you eat more high fiber, that's the one that's most likely to reverse the plaque?
Right.
Okay, got it.
As opposed to any of the others. Also low sugar, because the low sugar is causing the triglyceride to go up in your blood. And the triglyceride is actually more dangerous than the LDL in terms of cardiovascular plaque formation. The odds-risk ratio for high triglyceride is 1.8 as opposed to 1.3 for high LDL. So By eating fruit rather than drinking a fruit juice, you're getting the fiber. And the fiber means that what you ate wasn't for you, it was for your bacteria, for the bacteria in your intestine.
Beautiful. Now, you just mentioned the odds ratio for, I think it was LDL versus...
Triglycerides versus LDL causing heart disease.
Right. Yesterday, I read an article that looked at sort of the old cholesterol link story versus...
Just dead.
Right. Versus, now you tell
dead.
me, it's, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I mean, the acronym is APO capital B. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, ApoB100 is the lipoprotein on the VLDL molecule, the triglyceride molecule, which comes from the liver only. And so when your ApoB is high, that means your triglyceride's high, which means that your liver is turning sugar into fat and exporting it. So it's a marker for increased sugar consumption.
And I was reading that a lot of the scientists who have demonstrated that particular marker is actually a better predictor of coronary incidents. They feel, so going back to sort of merchants of doubts, that the narrative of cholesterol is so entrenched within the medical community that even if they were to come up with incontrovertible evidence, that it's very hard to get practicing physicians to alter their position.
Indeed. So this, I couldn't agree more. In fact, it is very hard to get physicians to alter their position on something they have taken such a stand on. So this brings up the question, and maybe we'll close with this notion for your audience. Max Planck, the famous German physicist, once threw out an offhand comment that science advances one funeral at a time. Okay? And the question is that true? Do people have to die in order for science to move forward? So the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, took this question on. And you can find the PDF online. Just put in, does science advance one funeral at a time? And what they did, which was really ingenious, was they took the list of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences for the last 20 years and took all the members of the two organizations and they made databases for each of them. They also looked at all the papers that those gurus published in over a 20-year period, and they made databases for each of the co-authors of each of those articles. So they had this massive database surrounding these intellectual scientific gurus. And they had 20 years of data. And what they did was they put a mark in each of the gurus' timeline. When did the guru die? And what they did was then they looked at the co-authors and looked at their paper productivity before the guru died and after the guru died. And they all fell off a cliff like that. Okay? Well, if they're not publishing in a field, who is? So they used mesh terms on those different papers to figure out who was now publishing in the field. And it turned out to be an entirely new set of investigators with an entirely new set of theories. In other words, they had empiric evidence that the honcho was holding the field hostage for the length of their lives. And indeed, science advances one funeral at a time.
I believe that
we're going to have to wait for a generational shift in order to see this. And we see this throughout public health.
I wonder if...
bicycle helmets and seatbelts.
Right.
Drunk driving. Smoking in public places, condoms in bathrooms. 30 years ago, every single one of these was anathema. If you'd brought up any of these in a state legislature, they'd have laughed you out of the place. Today, they're all facts of life. And the reason is because we taught people, and the children that we taught are now in charge. And they're fixing it.
Right.
And this is part of what happens in society. These are tectonic generational shifts. And we are now debunking the nutritional and the neurochemical data of the previous generation. That's what research is for. But it's going to take a generation to see the results.
I'll just end with this and then I'll say goodbye. I believe, and I could be wrong, that Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher of science, might have remarked something similar to the anecdote that you gave about Max Planck, namely that to have a really sort of paradigm shift, you have to wait for the ones who were working within the existing paradigm to die off. So I think it's the same
concept.
Rob, what a pleasure to talk to you. We could go on for a few more hours. Likewise,
yes,
stay on the line so I could tell you goodbye offline. This talk should probably be up later today. Thank you so much, Rob. A real pleasure.
Thank you for having me, God. My pleasure.
Cheers.